computer. And so now we're going to record our study of the reading from Hebrews, and Jim Owen has volunteered to read this one for us. And while Jim's reading, we'll all jot down any phrases or images, words that resonate with us. Okay, it's all yours, Jim.
Reading from the letter to the Hebrews. In the days when Christ Jesus was in the flesh, he offered prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to the one who was able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverence. Son though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered. And when he was made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him.
Okay, the word of the Lord, and thanks be to God. Any images or thoughts that came to people as Jim was reading?
Well, me again. I think this kind of speaks more to his humanity than it does to his divinity.
Okay, at this point, we're not explaining things, but just the phrase that hits you, that gives you that impression.
Source of eternal salvation.
Source of eternal salvation, okay?
In flesh.
In flesh, And if my remarks don't touch on these things, we can discuss them a little more after I do my presentation.
Obedience from what he suffered.
Obedience from what he suffered. Okay, I'll go into my presentation here. Older Bibles, if you have an old Douay or a King James, sometimes attributed the epistle to the Hebrews to Paul. Scholars today often echo the Origen, who wrote about the year 200. He said, only God who knows who wrote this epistle. That Paul did not write it is so certain that our lectionary now reads, the lector is supposed to say, a reading from the letter to the Hebrews. And some lectors, thinking that's a mistake, try to correct it, saying a reading from the letter of Paul to the Hebrews. But actually, scholarship is so unanimous on this that it has even influenced our lectionary, that we no longer say from Paul to the Hebrews. An overview of Hebrews, it portrays Jesus as our heavenly high priest. This is an unusual image in the New Testament. Neither Jesus, while on earth, nor any Christian is called a priest in the New Testament. When we're talking about priests in the New Testament, we're talking about people running pagan temples or the temple in Jerusalem. So he's the problem is, so Jesus is our heavenly high priest. The problem is Jesus is from the wrong tribe. He's a descendant of David, who is from the tribe of Judah. And according to the law of Moses, priests have to come from the tribe of Levi. So the solution of the author of Hebrews is that he calls Jesus a priest like Melchizedek. Another translation is in the order of Melchizedek. Melchizedek, so at the time of Abraham, 500 years before Moses, Melchizedek was the Jebusite king of Jerusalem. And the Jebusite kings, like most Canaanite kings, functioned as priests. After Davidic kings began to rule in Jerusalem, Jerusalem was not taken by Joshua. It was in such a secure position, no one was able to take it until one of David's men managed to sneak in through the water shaft, and David eventually gets Jerusalem. So once the Davidic kings began to rule from Jerusalem, apparently they claimed the right to act as priests as the previous kings of Jerusalem had done, all the way back to Melchizedek and earlier. Psalm 110 was written by someone to lend support to the right of the Davidic king to act in a priestly manner. You are a priest after the order of Melchizedek. Davidic kings heard this on the day they were enthroned, perhaps on the anniversary of enthronement. When the law of Moses was put into writing about 500 BC, this royal privilege was not recognized. So there are tensions in ancient Israel between kings and priests, and these are analogous to our modern tensions between church and state. And I say analogous because we view the state as secular and the church as sacred, whereas in the ancient world, both monarchy and priesthood were sacred institutions. That's why up until recent centuries, people talked about the divine right of kings, and why the American Revolution was considered to be actually impious, because we were rebelling against someone that God had put in authority over us. We think very differently. So this was analogous to church and state. But the Persians, about 500 BC, they were not allowing the Jews to have a king. They said, your priests are going to be your rulers. And the Torah, so there was no king around to defend his royal prerogatives. The Persians wouldn't have one. And so the priests who did the final versions of the law of Moses, they were sure to uphold their own rights and minimize what they thought of as priestly, as kingly incursions into their field. So anyway, the author of Hebrews now is going to claim this ancient royal privilege for Jesus. And he's going to claim not only is he a priest according to the order of Melchizedek, but that's better than being a Levitical priest. Hebrews tells the story of how Abraham paid tribute to Melchizedek. You can read the original in Genesis 14. And the argument is that one who is inferior pays tribute to one who is superior. It also, in the ancient biology, everything comes from the male for making a new person. The woman just provides a place where the man's seed can grow in the ancient biology. So when Abraham paid tribute, all of his descendants in his loins were paying tribute as well. That includes Isaac, his son, Jacob, his grandson, and all 12 sons of Jacob, including Levi, the great-grandsons of Abraham. Through Abraham, Levi, and through him, Levi is the ancestor of all the priests, and through Levi, all future priests paid tribute to Melchizedek. Therefore, the priesthood of Melchizedek is superior to the priesthood of Levi, and Jesus, who's priest according to Melchizedek, is superior than a priest according to Levi. Today's passage, our high priest is sensitive to our weakness, which he shared. The reference to prayers and supplications with loud cries seems to be a variant from the Gethsemane tradition. In the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus prays for God to change his will, to let the cup pass away. When we get to the gospel, we'll see the Johannine Jesus does not do that. But the Synoptic Jesus prays for God to change his mind. But there's no report in Matthew, Mark, or Luke of loud cries and tears. So you would never get that image from reading the Gospels. So that's why I call this a different version of the Gethsemane tradition. He learned obedience. Later Christology will have some difficulty with the idea that Jesus learned, with the idea that Jesus didn't know everything. However, Luke states that the young Jesus grew and became strong, filled with wisdom. And the Markan Jesus can say, when the woman with the flow of blood in the crowd touches him, who touched me? Matthew was embarrassed enough to leave the question out of his version of the story. So for the earliest thought, learning was not a problem for Jesus, for the New Testament authors to imagine Jesus learning. As the New Testament goes on, they start to have problems with this. But Jesus learning obedience is not a problem for the author of Hebrews. Learning is simply part of being human, and learning obedience is simply part of being human. When he was made perfect, perfect is not used in a moral sense. Rather, it's used in its root meaning of being completed. Being completed, perfected, is what is called by scholars a divine passive. It's a reverent Jewish way of saying that God is the one who completed Jesus, that God is the one who promoted him to his destiny. That is, that he is a high priest according to Melchizedek. It's God who makes Jesus this high priest on the day of his resurrection, as Hebrews views this. In the present context, it refers to God in the person of Jesus during his passion and especially at the resurrection. A similar sentiment is found in Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, but Paul is stressing, as is his habit, he's stressing more the passion than the resurrection. In Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, and entrusting to us the message of reconciliation. So he becomes then the source of salvation for all who obey him. So he has learned obedience, and then God has at the resurrection ordained him as our heavenly high priest with authority to rule. And so he is the source of salvation for all who obey him. This is the punchline. This is the purpose of God's activity in Jesus as understood by the author of Hebrews. So at this time, I'll finish mine and ask if anyone has any questions, comments, or additional observations that you would like to make.
Father Pat,
Yes.
I'm still a little unclear on when he was made perfect. Is it the resurrection that did it?
That's how I understand it. That it's when he becomes the heavenly high priest.
Okay.
However, you do get some imagery of the cross in there, and Hebrews might be. I need to study Hebrews more. I've never lectured on Hebrews. Hebrews might be more like John. John considers cross, resurrection, ascension one act of lifting up, exaltation. And Hebrews, if Hebrews is viewing them that way, then I would say cross resurrection rather than just resurrection. Excellent question. I once did a guided study for the University of Dallas. A student wanted to study the epistle to the Hebrews, and I agreed, and I read the paper and all, and but I've never prepared lectures on the epistle to the Hebrews. So if you want to learn something, teach it, and I haven't learned Hebrews yet. Other questions, comments, or observations?
But Father, it was given to the Hebrews, whoever did it or whoever wrote it. This letter was written to the Hebrews, correct?
Yes, and the other thing though is we're not sure who the Hebrews are. And one theory is that this is an effort to convert Jewish people who don't believe in Jesus to Christianity. Another theory is that it's written to Hebrew or Aramaic speaking Christians. Often Hebrew is called, or Aramaic is called Hebrew because it's written with the same alphabet. So it could be like there was a Jewish version of Christianity, and there's a gospel to the Hebrews, and it appears that the Apostle James was like the main apostle, the most important apostle, as far as this branch of Christianity thought of apostles. James was the main man because James, the brother of the Lord. However, what happened was in 70 AD, when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, and this Jewish Christianity, with such great respect for James, was centered in Jerusalem, then just as the Sadducees in Judaism lost their power base and Pharisees then became the main teachers in Judaism, so the destruction of Jerusalem resulted in Gentile Christianity having far more influence. Paul's version of Christianity having far more influence in the Jesus movement than it ever could have possibly have had while Jerusalem remained standing. And there was, if you read in the Acts of the Apostles, there's a group of Christians and they're praying daily in the temple. And people ask me, when did Christians stop going to the temple? And I say, they stopped going to the temple the same days that Jews stopped, the day that the Romans burned it down.
Okay. They really did, yeah.
Hadn't burned down the temple, you can be sure that there would be a version of Christianity that still practiced animal sacrifice. What happens is that, like the Pharisees, who are saying, well, we have the Torah, and they're going to make a virtue out of necessity. Christians' theology in the Epistle to Hebrews is going to make a virtue out of necessity. It's when he's writing, the temple has been destroyed, and so all the sacrifices he's talking about, he uses the example of the tent in the wilderness, but basically he's showing how Jesus is so superior to this kind of sacrifice that we don't need it anymore. So theology often makes a virtue out of necessity. One day we'll do that by making married men priests and women priests, but I'm fond of saying, the question of we need to pray for more vocations, and God has already answered that prayer. The answer is no. And God is not going to change those he's calling to be priests. We need to change ourselves and recognize more of the people that God is calling to be priests. But that's why I'm not Pope, you see.
Thank you.
Okay, well, okay, so we'll reflect now, what is the good news and what is the challenge in this reading from Hebrews? What would be the good news for those who first heard it? What's the good news for us? What is the challenge for them and the challenge for us?
Father, I think the good news is pretty well summed up in the last line there, that he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. Yes, excellent. I think a challenge for the original hearers was to come to a new perspective on animal sacrifice. I think that was a challenge. We just take it for granted. I think an analogy is that before Vatican II, we looked on the Mass only as a sacrifice. It was Protestant to think of the Mass as a meal. And Avery Dulles wrote a book, Models of the Church, and somebody else, and it was, it's not that one is right or one is wrong, but you have like the perfect society, or you have the pilgrim people of God, you have a hierarchical structure, and you see something about the reality of the church by using these different models to look at it. And similarly, I forget Kevin's last name, but Diane Rachel recommended this book to me, Models of the Eucharist. And there's the sacrificial model, there's the meal model, and several other models that he looks at. They don't come to me right away. And I think one of the challenges for Catholicism, for us as a church today, is to come to an awareness and appreciation of some of these newer models. Doesn't mean that we no longer think of the Eucharist as a sacrifice, but that's not the only way that we think about it. For my 2 cents worth on challenge. Okay, we'll stop